paw sculpture, I started with a paper template, and then from there I used a circle from a top of a can. Then I used water-based clay, and adding the water-based clay on top of the circle, I was able to create a medallion shape that I was looking for. After I got the water-based clay into the shape I needed, I used a paper template and I placed it back on top of the clay and used a pin to poke little holes in it. After the holes were poked through, I took the paper off and I was able to see my pattern. From there I used my clay tools to sculpt out the paw shape. By using water and paint brushes, I was able to smooth it out and I attached it to a board. I put some release agent on it, and at this point the sculpture is ready to be molded. So I used a little metal ring, I placed that around it, glued it on. To make a mold of the sculpture, we're going to use a 2-part silicone rubber. So you mix the 2 parts together, you mix them up pretty well so that you see a nice consistent orangey color in this particular material. So once it's mixed up, you place your model back down, and then what we'll do is we'll pour the rubber in. Once the mold is made, you can make many castings from this mold. After about 12 hours, the silicone rubber has set, so you can take the glue, the metal shim off, and then you now have your flexible rubber mold, which you will be able to make all your plaster castings in. So you just pop the clay out, you're finished. To make the castings, we're going to use hydrocal plaster. So we have our plaster, we have a container to mix it in, and then we're going to fill the container with a portion of water that's already been metered out. From there we'll place in our plaster, build up a little mountain of plaster, and then basically from there we're going to let that sit as the plaster soaks into the water. Now that the plaster is soaking, we'll set it aside and we're going to set out a couple of blocks of wood and place a flat piece of wood on top. We're going to take the molds, we're going to rinse them out with a little bit of soapy water so that when the plaster is poured in, it will allow the surface tension for the plaster to break apart, so the air bubbles will rise to the surface. So now that the molds are set up, we have our hooks, and these are the hooks that we're going to be placing into the plaster at the little black lines so that the piece can be hung up when it's done. Now that the plaster is soaked, we can now mix it. So I'm going to use a drill with a mixer on it just to speed it along, and then basically from there we'll just kind of mix it. Once it's mixed, we pour it into the molds, and you allow it kind of go almost to the very top. And then at that point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that board and I'm going to bang it, and I'm going to try to get all the air bubbles that are in the plaster to rise to the surface. Once I feel most of the bubbles are out of the surface of the plaster, we can let it sit for a second. Now that the plaster is set for a second, we're going to take a tool and just kind of strike off the top edge, flatten out the backs of the pieces, and then those hooks that we originally were looking at, we're going to use those to place in at the little black lines. The black line indicates the top of the casting, so I know exactly where to place them. After about 45 minutes, the plaster is set, so it's gone through an exothermic reaction, and now the plaster is actually hard. So as you can see, as I pop the castings out of the mold, you can see the plaster breaks away and the pieces come out nice and clean, and you have this nice smooth surface to them. So at this point, the castings are almost finished. Now around the edge of the casting, you're going to get a little bit of what's called a shim line. So what we will do is we're going to take a rasp and we just kind of file that off. Once we kind of go around the edge of the casting and file that off, we'll just take a piece of 120 grit sandpaper and just kind of quickly clean off the edge. And there you go. Once your molds are made, you can make as many castings as you need. Once the castings are done, you let them dry for about a week and then you can prime them. So once the castings have dried for about a week, you can prime them. By priming the casting, it allows for any paint that you decide to color your casting with to adhere to it better. When I have to prime a lot of castings, I'll use a larger spray gun and spray many at one time.